to State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well, broadcasting on KSQD Santa Cruz on 90.7 FM and live streaming at ksqd.org. I'm the producer and host, Deborah Sloss, licensed marriage and family therapist. Today, we're going to be discussing the mental health challenges facing first responders. These are the folks who are usually the first on the scene to face challenging, dangerous, and draining situations. They're also the first to reach out to disaster survivors and provide emotional and physical support to them. While these duties may be essential to the community, they are strenuous for the first responders and with time put them at increased risk of trauma. In using the term first responders, we're referring to emergency medical services, firefighters, and police officers. According to a report issued by the National Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, often referred to as SAMHSA, one of the core risk factors for first responders is the pace of their work. First responders are always on the front line facing highly stressful and risky calls. This tempo can lead to an inability to integrate difficult work experiences. As a result, depression, stress, and post-traumatic stress symptoms, suicidal ideation, and a host of other functional and relational conditions have been reported. According to a 2018 supplemental research bulletin from SAMHSA, depression and PTSD affect approximately 1/3 of all first responders. Additionally, 37% of fire and emergency medical service professionals have contemplated suicide. This is nearly 10 times the rate of American adults in the general population. A couple of months ago, in our show called Mental Health Crisis Toolkit, we were joined by guests discussing their experiences of using mental health crisis services. This often means calling 911. Our guests talked about how their experiences with the law enforcement who responded had improved dramatically as a result of officers getting specialized mental health crisis intervention training. As a follow-up to that show, we were interested in the other side of that equation, the mental health challenges the officers and first responders also face as a result of attending to those and other emergency 911 calls for help from the community. Today, we'll be joined by two Santa Cruz City police officers, Brian Warren and Connor Bridges, to share about their own experiences on the job and about their involvement with the peer support team program. Also with us is critical incident specialist and licensed marriage and family therapist, Laurel Andrus. We want our listeners to be aware that we will be discussing difficult content, traumatic events, and suicide in this show. Also, we ask you to forgive any sound quality issues. Due to the pandemic, we're recording from remote locations, which brings with it uncontrollable factors. Let me tell you more about our remarkable guests today. Brian Warren has been a police officer for 14 years with the Santa Cruz Police Department. He's been assigned as a patrol officer, downtown officer, field training officer, and a detective. While a detective, Brian investigated both property and persons crimes. These included fraud, elder abuse, sexual assault crimes, gang crimes, and homicides. Brian joined the peer support team after the murders of Detective Sergeant Butch Baker and Detective Elizabeth Butler in 2013 and has been a member ever since. Brian has been married for 19 years and is the proud father of two amazing daughters. Connor Bridges is a 29-year-old Santa Cruz native who's been a police officer for the city of Santa Cruz for 5 years. Prior to becoming a police officer, he volunteered with the department for another 5 years. Connor currently serves the department as a detective in the investigations unit. He's a member of the peer support team, and in his off time, he enjoys spending time with friends and family, being outdoors, and says he's constantly seeking experiences that bring adventure or laughs. Laurel Andrus began running groups 35 years ago at the time of the Central Coast floods. She coordinated and facilitated emergency medical services for the Marina District in San Francisco during the aftermath of the Loma Prieta earthquake and has since debriefed and counseled numerous companies, work groups, and first responder communities following acute disasters and periods of long-term stress. She has advanced training in critical incident management, high conflict mediation, and organizational excellence. Laurel maintains a private psychotherapy practice specializing in trauma recovery, family and partnership improvement, and work-related difficulties. She's also a trainer, mediator, and leadership consultant to the business sector, government agencies, academic institutions, and hospitals around issues of stress management, strategic communication, vision and mission, and balancing work and home life. We're honored to have these three guests here with us today to talk about the mental health challenges facing police officers and all first responders. And I want to welcome all three guests, Brian, Connor, and Laurel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So let's jump right in. Brian, how about we start with you? You've had 14 years as a police officer. Can you share with us the kinds of experiences you've had on the police force that have been particularly challenging for your mental health?
Certainly. Probably the one that comes to mind first and foremost were the murders of Detective Sergeant Butch Baker and Detective Elizabeth Butler. I was one of the first officers to respond out to the scene after the event had happened. And the aftermath of that was just very formative for me, dealing with the own feelings that I was feeling, dealing with the feelings of other officers, seeing how people were not dealing with the situation in a positive way, seeing how other people dealt with the situation as good as they could. That really started my journey to figure out my mental health issues and what I could do to be a more supportive officer, be a better husband, be a better father. And that was probably what the biggest one for me. Since then, I've dealt with a lot of child sex crimes, which are very difficult to deal with. Every time you deal with the child sex victim, you associate that some way, somehow to one of your children, a friend's child, a family member, things like that, to where it's just hard to deal with. It's icky, yucky, gross things, and you have to be professional, 100%. I assisted in the investigation to the death of Maddie Middleton. And that one was just a roller coaster, kind of a marathon of a case. I mean, up for 36, 48 hours, working nonstop, doing very important work under very stressful circumstances, and really trying to put your best foot forward, because everything that you do in those first few days are going to be scrutinized. And well, how come you didn't do this? And how come you didn't do that? So in addition to a very hard case, a very traumatizing case, you're also having to be as perfect as you can be so that you don't make mistakes. And it really adds to it's hard to debrief those situations. It's hard to wind down from those situations because you're never really done with it. It could be a year later where you have another hearing. You have to go over your report. So it's not something that you can just do in the moment and then put behind you. It's going to be there with you for 5-6 years after the fact. Those are some of the two that really stand out. And then there's other little ones that will kind of pile on. And if you don't address those, you can get into a bad spot pretty quickly.
Connor, I understand that growing up, you set your sights on being a police officer pretty early on. And you have now 5 years with the Santa Cruz Police Department under your belt. In that time, what work experiences have been particularly challenging for your mental health? And what's been a surprise to you compared to what you imagined as a child, becoming a police officer?
Yeah, 5 years is in some careers is kind of a long time. In law enforcement, I'm still kind of considered a relatively new member of the department. Something right off the bat that's been unique is just every day is different, and that's something that was very rewarding, but can also be very challenging. So you have to learn pretty quickly to wear lots of different hats. Sometimes you're supporting a victim, you're in a high-speed chase, you're telling a family member that one of their loved ones has passed away or has been victimized in a crime. So constantly jumping around and having to kind of deal with the different paces and the different roles that can happen almost instantaneously can kind of lead you on a bit of a roller coaster that's been kind of hard to keep up with. Some other experiences pretty early on in my career. An academy mate that I went through the police academy with was involved in a high stress incident where he was struck by a vehicle, and the suspect in that case attempted to run him over. There was other officers involved in the incident that ended up discharging their firearms. I was one of the first officers to get to that call and be involved in that. And so that was pretty early on a stressful experience for me that kind of honed in on the dangers of this job and understanding how quickly things can go wrong. Being from Santa Cruz has been, a great experience, being able to give back to the community that I was raised in, and having people in this community that have taught me how to read and do math. But it's also a difficult thing. Sometimes I come across people and victims that I've had close relationships with. And that in itself can be somewhat challenging to kind of try and experience, doing what I can to help those people, but also having an emotional connection to them on a very personal level. And then as Brian said, a lot of this job, you never really know what's going to happen. And sometimes these calls can be very stressful and very crazy, and you can deal with them and everything goes, the way that you want it to. But after the fact, you never really know how a call is going to stick with you. And I think that's something being on for about 5 years that I'm starting to realize is sometimes I will wake up in the middle of the night and I'll be kind of thinking about something that recently happened, or a call that I recently went to, or an outcome, or things like that. And I have a hard time turning my brain off sometimes, and I'll end up not being able to go back to sleep. And sometimes you'll go to another call and it'll remind you of that call or that instance, or what happened to that victim, or how you yourself handled that experience. And that can sometimes bring up some emotion and some stress. And oftentimes it's kind of hard to communicate about that, and reaching out to people and being able to share those experiences. I'm lucky to work with a lot of people like Brian that have been through a lot of these things, and I can kind of share those experiences with him.
Laurel, I'm imagining that as you listen to Brian and Connor, there's things that you've worked with so many different groups, first responder groups, and law enforcement. I'm wondering if you're hearing certain things that are, typical, or that you want to extend on any of the things that you've heard and explain more about those experiences generally for first responders.
What struck me when Connor was just talking was with police and with fire and AMR, they'll often have a memory, right? We get triggered in our reptilian brain where we are most attuned to if we're safe or not. And on any corner in this town, there was something one of those first responders had to literally clean up, pick up, deal with, mediate, stop, or brush away. And so just driving through town, I think police and fire and sheriff can be triggered. The place at Doyle where Butch and Beth were shot, they still have, there's bullet marks still in that wall. Or when the fire guy was shot at, now they have big armored trucks. And so sometimes people say, well, why are they armoring up? Because they've been shot at and they remember that. At the same time, because we're empathic by nature, we're tribal by nature, each one of these gentlemen and their teams feel what their partners go through. And they'll walk through the halls and say, hey, man, that must have been tough. And we're starting to have a culture where it's not like, you okay? Yeah, I'm okay. But really, what happened on Friday? That was a gnarly scene. How are you doing? We now have peer teams that extend across the county so that peers of different agencies can meet and say, how was that? I saw you on that call. And that leads to what Deborah, is what's called post-traumatic resilience, which is the bond, right? It's the brotherhood, sisterhood, the family of all of us who were out at Westcliff when. And so it's both scary to hold their material for each other, and also loving bonding to hold each other's material.
You're tuned to listener-supported 90.7 FM KSQD Santa Cruz. K-Squid, many voices, one station. And this is State of Mind, being human and living well. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, and I'm here talking with two City of Santa Cruz police officers, Brian Warren and Connor Bridges, about their experience of stress and trauma on the job, how they address their own mental health needs, and their involvement with a peer support team program. Also with us is critical incident specialist and licensed marriage and family therapist, Laurel Andrus. Stay with us to learn more about the mental health needs of first responders, and we'll be right back after this brief message from our underwriter.
KSQD thanks Family Service Agency of the Central Coast for supporting this program. Family Service Agency provides counseling and support for people of all ages facing life crises and challenges. You can reach them at 423-9444 to see if they can help you. Thank you, Family Service Agency of the Central Coast, for supporting KSQD 90.7 FM.
Now, back to our interview. Laurel, you've also worked with a lot of other first responders, including 911 dispatchers, sheriffs, firefighters, and frontline workers like medical and probation staff. When you listen to what Brian and Connor share about their own stories, do you hear themes or challenges that are reminiscent of those other groups? And what similarities and or differences do you see between those and law enforcement?
Well, the first thing that strikes me is that I'm thinking of Netcom 911, that they are the first people to be on scene, so to speak, and they hear what the call is. They call out for resources, but often don't know what the outcome is. And that can be particularly hard. Or when there's a big event, Brian was talking about the line of duty death, there were people out on the perimeter that didn't know what was going on inside. And so this is the important role of critical incident debriefing, where we try to get as many agencies together in the room as possible to piece together, not like what Brian was saying, to critique or find out what went wrong, but simply what happened. And on our recent, very unfortunate loss of Damon Gutzweiler over the summer, we had 100 people in a room during COVID, all masked, all sharing what they saw, what they didn't see, what they heard.
Just for our listeners that might not know, that was a
sheriff. It was a sheriff
that was shot during the summer.
Right. Ambushed. And it was important for them to get together as a whole team, to cry their tears, to have some grief, to have the ritual of talking to one another, so that they can piece together what the heck happened. Not knowing how a scene rolled out, or only being perimeter, or only having the first call, is a vicarious trauma that's sometimes worse than being directly on scene, because you can't put it all together.
And that is one thing that we know about trauma, that being able to put the pieces into some kind of coherent narrative often is a protective factor. So, Brian, I know that within your 14-year career, you've had many different phases and different roles that you've fulfilled. And I'm wondering, what's been inherently challenging to your mental health because of the specific demands of that role within law enforcement?
I would say investigations was probably the most, I guess if you want to call it, troublesome. Just because like I said, you're reliving the same case and the same incident for days on end, hours on end. Patrol officers, it's different for them a little bit, because they can go to, say, a homicide scene, and they go and there's a dead body there and there's work to do. And so you immediately make the scene safe. When you step back and you are, doing other tasks, and then you go right on to the next crime. In investigations, you're going to go out, you're going to take photos of the dead body, you're going to do measurements, you're going to be working around a deceased person for hours at a time. Sometimes it can be 6 or 7 hours, and maybe it's outside, maybe it's inside, and you're dealing with that. And then you have to go to, maybe 2 days later, you go to the autopsy. And so you're in there and you're back with that person and you're doing the autopsy, and it's a clinical setting, obviously, but you just don't get a break from it for 4 or 5 days at a minimum after a homicide. And that's very tough. It's very taxing. It's long hours. It's hard on your family. It's hard on you personally. In the meanwhile, there's other work that's stacking up behind that. So you know that you're spending all this time and all this effort, and yet there's more to come when you're done. There's not a lot of ways to spread the work around. It's always going to be there, and it just kind of piles up. I know that when I stepped away from investigations back into patrol, the weight was off of my shoulders and I felt really light. Doing it for 6 years is a long time. So being able to step away from that and getting away from a caseload and getting away from the constant work pileup was very freeing for me. And now I can go out there and do the everyday stuff, and I still see the dead people and I still respond to those critical incidents, but it's done and I move on to the next thing. And that's, for me, kind of been there, done that. It feels freeing.
So as I listen to you, I'm thinking that people in first responder roles really need to pay attention to which ones work for them. I mean, for some people might work to stay in an investigative role for a long time, but you found for you that there was only so long that you could do that for before you needed a change.
Yes, I think it's listening to yourself. It's having people around you that recognize this isn't maybe the healthiest for you, and it's a good job and it's a good role, and it's very imperative that we have people that are dedicated to doing that sort of work and being detail oriented. But at the same time, you also have to really take care of your mental health and realize there's a time and a place, and you maybe need to remove yourself from that for a period of time to kind of have a reset.
So, Connor, is that a role that you've now recently stepped into as a detective?
That's correct. Yeah, I've recently stepped into the role, transitioned from patrol into my new role as a detective, which I've been doing for the last 6 months. I'd like to echo everything Brian said. I think that as a patrol officer, um, oftentimes your day can end when you step into the locker room and you hang up your equipment and take your uniform off. And you walk out the building, and that's kind of it. I mean, you may have dealt with something very stressful or emotional in that day that might carry with you at home. But for the most part, your day is over when you step out of the locker room. As a detective, oftentimes your phone is ringing at all hours of the night. You're constantly being called into court. You're constantly having to do follow up on these many, many cases that you're doing, and the work never really stops. You can step out of the building, but chances are you're probably going to be doing things at home, or your brain is going to continue to run and think about all the different things that you maybe thought you should have done or still need to do, and what your day is going to be like tomorrow and where you're going to pick up where you left off. So I would say that's probably one of the biggest differences. And with that comes the caseload. As my current assignment, I mean, I have a caseload that ranges from homicides, shootings, stabbings, robberies, sexual assaults, child abuse cases, and trying to navigate your way through all that, especially as a new detective, is pretty daunting. It's something that I wish I didn't carry with me all the time, but unfortunately I do. And I've even heard firsthand from my personal relationships and my family that they've seen a change in me in the last 6 months. My stress has just gone through the roof. And I think that that's because I care. I care about these people. I care about what's happened to them. I care about bringing families and victims justice. That's why I got into this job. But with that comes an immense amount of pressure. And I feel it.
All the more reason that finding that adventure and laughs that you talked about in your bio is really important to balance that, I imagine.
Absolutely.
So, Laurel, in getting ready for the show, I looked into some research and I saw that recent studies have shown that police officers are at higher risk of suicide than any other profession. And the number of police officers who died by suicide is more than triple that of officers who were fatally injured in the line of duty. Can you talk some about the risk factors for law enforcement and what specifically can make officers more or less at risk and why?
I'll try. It's pretty complicated. Um, I think one of the things that we are watching in COVID, when we learned that New York was so inundated and that there were physicians in Italy and in New York City who were committing suicide, and they got some press about that, was the sense of helplessness. So if you imagine getting small to large pressure washes of cortisol and adrenaline every day, multiple times, Connor just walked through what a normal day was. And even if you are immune to some of that because it's just a day's work, you're still rushing in stress hormones. And so if you add to that some of the beliefs that are common in first responders, which is a pretty rigid identification with role and responsibility, externally focused on getting things done, being a fixer, which is part of fight, flight, fix, right? And if they can't fix it because it's already gone down and they're filled with cortisol and adrenaline, and they're not really allowed to cry on scene, that wouldn't be good. So there's a standard professional suppression of their emotions, and the feeling that they're responsible, and the detective is responsible at 2 a.m. and the patrol better write it up and show up in court. That is a constant compression of a being. And so we talk about self-care, but when it's in your consciousness all the way down to your unconscious, you better be working hard to surf, to bike, to garden, to bake, to play with your kids and blow bubbles. And even that, does that contact that chronic sense of stress? So yes, there's folks who have all those belief systems, and they are our heroes, they are our warriors, are also 4 times more likely to become ill, to die earlier than their appointed time, or to take their own lives because of that overwhelm.
Can you talk about perhaps some of the warning signs that people who love these first responders or are in their lives might see, or first responders might see in themselves, um, when they're struggling with mental health challenges or trauma?
What we know is that trauma, mental health, substance abuse all go together. So it's an old corny joke of just going out and hitting the bar afterwards. And that has become less and less true for most of our agencies, but it's still a common thing. Let's go share a beer. And when does a beer turn into a 6-pack? And when does a 6-pack turn into a bourbon? So peers can watch peers go down that rabbit hole and hold on to that. Partners watch it all the time. More often it's less insidious and more like, I just come home, I hit my lazy boy, I turn on my remote and I'm gone. I can't talk anymore. My ears are full, my mouth is tired, there's nothing good I want to say. And so there's just this withdrawal. And so we don't know, is that depression? Is that self-care? Where are you going, buddy? Mommy, you okay? And partners and kids of cops know to be careful and not ask too much, but also keep tabs. Then there's irritability, then there's rage, then there's sometimes impetuous buying. Look, if I'm working this hard, I deserve a new truck. And although that could be self-care, it could also be a debt problem. And so we're looking for those little aberrant behaviors that are growing. Or as Connor so sweetly said, my people are starting to see me pull away, even small. And so that's the time to reach out, to make a referral, to have a peer reach out, and to use some of the resources that we'll talk about today.
Good. Well, right, we're going to take a station break, but right after that, we will be talking about what does reaching out mean and what can that look like for people. You're tuned to listener-supported 90.7 FM KSQD, K-Squid, many voices, one station. And this is State of Mind, being human and living well. We're also live streaming on the web at ksqd.org. You can find all the podcast episodes of our shows on Apple and Google Podcasts and on the KSQD website. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, and I'm here talking with 2 Santa Cruz City police officers, Brian Warren and Connor Bridges, about the demands of their job and the resulting stress and trauma. We're also talking about their involvement with a peer support team program. Also joining us is critical incident specialist and licensed marriage and family therapist, Laurel Andrus, to help us understand more about the mental health needs of first responders and what departments are doing to meet them. I want to remind our listeners that every State of Mind show has a resource list posted along with it, and the resources we talk about today can be found on the post for this show at ksqd.org/state-of-mind/. Now, back to our interview. Brian, you've had a lot of years on the police force, and you've probably seen things change in the culture over that time. I'm wondering what you've seen with regards to awareness and willingness to address mental health challenges, and what's been the catalyst for those changes.
I think we have a younger police force. We have a new generation of police officers. I'm in my 40s, and I'm one of the older guys here at the department. I'm probably in the top 20% of the officers here as far as age goes. So I think we've got a younger police force. We have a better educated police force. We have people that are probably more in touch with, for lack of a better term, they're more in touch with their feelings. I think they recognize earlier and more often what they're feeling, and they're ready to talk about it without shame, without this kind of stigma of, you're weak if you talk about stuff. It's very different from when I first started, when you kind of saw some of these older cops that had been around. They're grizzled, dirty uniforms, maybe they shaved, maybe they didn't. Just a different generation of officer. And I think that's changed a lot for the better. I think we have officers that care about their mental health. They're definitely more willing to talk about it. I know that our debriefs, people actually have been asking for debriefs. They've sought them out, and I think we have a lot more participation in those for critical incidents. And I think we're on our way to being a healthier profession as far as that goes. We still have a lot of things that we face from the outside. We still have things we face from the inside, but I think we're more willing to get help. And I think that's going to let us be in this profession longer.
Can you tell us some about what local law enforcement is doing to help officers deal with the mental health challenges we've been talking about? And what kinds of things do you see making a real difference for the officers?
For me, I think the peer support team is really huge. It's not something that people are ashamed of to be a part of. It's not something that people are ashamed to talk about in the halls. It's really kind of breaking down the mystery of, well, what do these guys do? Well, we sit around and we talk a lot about ourselves. We get stuff out in the open. We debrief our own incidents, and then we reach out to other officers who we see may be struggling. And I think that we do that as a county. We do that with NetCom. We do that with the sheriff's office. We do that with the other local agencies. The fire department is huge on it. And by talking about those experiences and sharing those experiences, we build credibility, and people know that they can come to us and it's confidential, that rumors don't get started out of the peer team. We are huge on that. And we kind of live and die by that, so to speak. We really maintain that confidentiality, and we get people help. I've seen officers that have been around for almost 20 plus years reaching out for help and taking advantage of the resources that they have available to them. And they're better people because of it, because they have that willingness to change. They see that other people have done it, and they know that they can do it too. So it's kind of demystifying all of that and helping them be better.
I can really imagine, you were saying it happens across agencies, that really builds relationships too, to these folks that are all showing up to the same calls, right? You're going to see those people again on calls, and now you have a much more personal and intimate relationship with them. Does that seem to make a difference in what happens at the calls?
I think it's maybe not at the call, because at the time of the call, we're all handling business and we're all doing different things. I'm doing something different from the firefighters who's, communicating with NetCom, but I know the faces of the people that I hear on the other end of the radio. I know what they look like without a mask on. It's been a while, but you build those relationships with those outside agencies, and it builds trust. And they can, maybe on that next call that you see them on, where it's not critical, and you've got a few minutes to chat. You might even have a little bit of a debrief from the previous call, maybe 2 or 3 days ago, and you just kind of check in, because what affected me one way affected them a completely different way, just because of their experience in that. And it's a relationship building tool, and I think it really helps.
Laurel, Brian was just talking about the peer support teams, and I'm wondering, can you describe in more detail what they are, and how it functions, and what it provides for officers and other first responders?
Sure. We started back in 2006 with a peer team at the PD and have added to the sheriff and to Central Fire and Aptos and Scotts Valley and pretty much all the agencies. We meet with them periodically. I meet with the police department almost every month. My colleague Nick Ross meets with Central Fire. Gloria Simpson, my colleague, meets with the sheriff. And we screen folks coming in if they're interested. We ask them to write a letter. Sometimes we shoulder tap folks who are really already doing that kind of work. We can see that they have an empathic heart and they're reaching out to people, that they're accessible. And then we put them through an interview process, and then we meet regularly. And in that team meeting, we have a didactic session about listening, how to make a referral stick, what's going on inside the department. Sometimes the stress is from administration or the POA or the budget or the city or whatever politics has been going on, and we get to talk about that. And then each person gets a check-in of how are they helping themselves and who have they reached out to, so that we're providing a net for the whole department. Somebody went out on disability. Did you call him? Did you call her? She just had a baby. Did somebody send flowers? So it's both a wellness team as well as more psychological check-ins.
So these are advocates that you're training within the department that then reach out to their peers. Is that how it works? Informally, they reach out to their peers?
Exactly right. So somebody will take somebody to coffee or drop over at their house. There's a new baby and they're not answering their phone much. Maybe they're sleeping, or maybe they're in postpartum depression. And it's worth it to have a friend, somebody that knows them, come and say, "Hey, how you doing?"
And these teams meet regularly to maybe talk about officers of concern, or sort of identify people that maybe aren't. Some people ask for the support, it sounds like, some officers, but others you might sort of initiate on their behalf. Is that correct?
I think it is true. I think of disabled folks or disabled. They've gone out on a stress injury, right? Somebody, hit their arm or knocked their finger, or something's wrong with their knee. And it is sad in our society, out of sight, out of mind, that, the statistics of people who leave or retire from work, and then nobody from work calls them, and they're just in cricket land. And we try to circumvent that and really reach out and say, "How you doing? You've been out on stress on your knee, on your hip for a month. How are you eating? How are you sleeping? Do you want to go out for coffee?" So that the family extends past the doors, both in the halls and those who have left the doors.
You mentioned something about a referral sticking. Could you say more about what that means?
So I'm thinking of a sheriff we worked with many years ago who taught us when we were first starting this system. He said, "I stand with them. I dial the phone to the camp or to their doc or to rehab or to a psychotherapist and say, 'Hi, I've got somebody right here with me, and I'm going to support them to stay on the line with them.'" So sometimes it's that kind of hand holding. And sometimes it's just saying, "What are you concerned about?" in that way of motivational interviewing. Do you have concerns? What worries you about your own behavior? If it were better, what would that look like? So that you're supporting somebody's readiness, not necessarily handing them a live phone, but it can range all the way up and down.
And are you finding that this approach is effective? What are you seeing in the departments? Like, it started in Santa Cruz, but then it's spread. So I'm assuming that means that you've seen some great benefits from taking this approach.
And I take very little credit for that. I think that it's a nationwide movement. It's now corporate wide, that now companies are realizing that these people spend more time in their companies than they do their homes. And if there isn't a peer team, and I'm not talking about HR, I'm talking about somebody in-house who's looking out for them, they're going to do better. They're going to have higher resilience, higher productivity. It serves the bottom line.
Connor, I understand you're involved in the peer support team. Can you talk about your role, and is it voluntary, and how have you found it to be important? Why have you found it important to be part of it?
Yeah, absolutely. It is a voluntary assignment. It's not a required thing. It's something that I think is very important for our department. I think one of the things that we already discussed is it can be anonymous and confidential, and I think that it is very important to the foundation of the team. I think that creates a willingness within the department to make our unit an approachable unit, which can be, a very big obstacle for people to tackle when trying to seek help or trying to seek resources. Concern about other people finding out, or am I going to be labeled for trying to seek help? So that's something that's very important to us on the team. As far as the team's presence and as far as that goes, as we're discussing today, law enforcement can take its toll on people, and we have to have things in place and people in place to create a support network. One of the things that really pushed me towards becoming involved in this team is I've lost friends to suicide that have been involved in public safety. So for me, I was really driven to be a part of this team to make my department a better place and a more supportive place for the men and women that serve our community. It's another thing that I think is important, and I think we already briefly touched on it, but it's unique to have this role where we have Laurel that is an expert. She can educate us and provide us tips on things that have been successful throughout her whole career and beneficial. And then we can sort of create a hybrid with the experience that we have from doing the job. So we can take Laurel's expertise and we can take our experience from doing and experiencing a lot of the things that these people within our department have gone through, firsthand experience with Laurel's expertise. And I think that kind of makes our team effective and successful, is that I can maybe relate with someone or find common ground while using the tools that Laurel's been able to provide me.
You're tuned to listener-supported 90.7 FM KSQD, K-Squid, community radio for the Monterey Bay. And this is State of Mind, being human and living well. We're also live streaming on the web at ksqd.org. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, and I'm here talking with two Santa Cruz City police officers, Brian Warren and Connor Bridges, about their experience of stress and trauma on the job, how they address their own mental health needs, and their involvement with a peer support team program. Also with us is critical incident specialist and licensed marriage and family therapist, Laurel Andrus. Stay with us to learn more about the mental health needs of first responders, and we'll be right back after this brief message from our underwriter.
KSQD thanks First Responder Support Network for supporting State of Mind. First Responder Support Network provides programs for first responders and their families to promote recovery from the effects of job-related traumatic stress. Information is available at www.frsn.org. That's www.frsn.org. Thank you, First Responder Support Network, for supporting community radio. K-Squid 90.7 FM.
Back to our interview. So coming back from the break, Laurel, I wanted to ask you about, we've been talking about the peer support team model, and I'm wondering what other forms of support are available and important for officers or first responders to consider using. And do you have specific recommendations or advisement for them or their family members?
You bet. So we'll start local and move out from there. In our town in Santa Cruz, people have, at most agencies, they have a contract with our team, of which there are 6 or 7. We just got a new clinician who are all culturally competent with law and fire and can get anywhere from 3 to 5 EAP sessions. And then from there, they can go to the next tier, which is either MHN or UBH. Sorry about all these acronyms. They're insurance company mental health carve out. And they have an intake specialist who's crisis oriented and can get them to somebody with an open practice quickly. Outside of that, the first responder network is a really great resource, and you could go on a web page and look up all the things they have in terms of articles and what they sponsor. There's also ICISF, and I'll tell you what that is, International Critical Incident Stress Foundation, and they have blogs and articles and resources and people to call. Lastly, there is the suicide hotline for law enforcement, and that's called Copline. It's 100% confidential, and I'll give you that number. It's 1-800-267-5463. They have clinicians. It is also peer supported. So that's when in doubt, call them. And lastly, we like to talk about the West Coast Post-Trauma Retreat Center up in Marin. And I know that you have a recorded announcement about that, and people can look that up. It's a wonderful resource where it's a 6-day program that is in-house, that's intensive. They have a spouses group that's part of that as well.
Connor and Brian, I wonder if you were to think about what you think is needed from here forward within your law enforcement community to improve support and mental health, and reduce suicide risk, what would you say that could be going forward?
I think that probably one of the important things is just overcoming the stigma surrounding mental health, specifically in the career of law enforcement. And I've only been around for 5 years, but I can already see changes in the last 5 years. Just continuing to be supportive of people being able to talk about the experiences they've had and the way that that's making them feel. I think as long as we can continue to push towards that and overcome the stigma, we're headed in the right direction. Just continuing to raise awareness and being able to make people feel comfortable to talk about what they're going through.
Before we wrap up, I always like to ask guests if they have any specific things that they've found to be helpful to them. So, we've been talking about the challenges, and I'm wondering the ways that you, Brian and Connor, support your own mental health. What do you do to take care of yourselves? And what do you, make sure that you do, or else you really see that it takes a toll if you don't?
For me, working out is probably the single most important thing that helps me get ready for the day and prepare for the day, and it starts my day off right. That's probably the biggest thing I have to do every day. And then also having a balance, kind of a police influence balance and an outside police influence balance, so that I don't just have one frame of mind. I just don't have one perspective on things. I can talk to people that work in the tech industry, that work in trades that I'm good friends with, and then I can, they hear the stories about what we do, and it's one way to de-stress and to talk about normal sort of life. But it's also important to have good friends in law enforcement, because they do really have an acute understanding of what you've been through, because they've been through the same thing or maybe on the same call. But it's maintaining that balance for me is imperative. That's where I really kind of discovered I felt a lot more free in my life, and I felt a lot more that I could be a truly productive member of society, and is keeping that balance and not going into the only cop thing, because cops understand cops and there's nowhere else that I can go to have understanding. I can have understanding a lot of different places, and it took me to get to that spot where I've like I said, balance is a huge thing. That's where I found that.
What about you, Connor? How do you take care of yourself?
Regular exercise has been very important for me. A healthy diet, getting outside is probably my number one. I really enjoyed kind of disconnecting with nature, just going out, even if it's for a hike, camping trip, go find a lake somewhere. We're fortunate in California that we're just surrounded by beautiful places. So that's probably my number one way to kind of de-stress, is to get out in nature and go find adventure and find new places and explore. But with that too, it is also a support network. Speaking with family members, talking with people outside of law enforcement, talking with people inside of law enforcement. I think that it's important to kind of discuss things that are maybe bothering you. Maybe it's not, specifically a one incident, but just about feelings you're having. Hey, I'm stressed out right now. This is what's going on. Or, what are you up to? How are things going in your job? Just having a dialogue and an open line of communication.
Okay, and I know, Brian, so we were getting ready to do the show. You had mentioned a book that you would recommend for people. Do you want to bring that up?
Yeah, sure. Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement. It was a great book for me to read. My wife read the book as well. It helped her. And we probably should have read it at the beginning of my law enforcement journey, not about halfway through when bad things were already happening. But nevertheless, we both went through it, and it was big for us because it helped me kind of understand some of the why behind what I was doing, and it helped her understand the same thing. And we were able to really come to a common ground.
Okay, great. Well, make sure that and all the resources we talk about are listed in our post with this show at ksqd.org. In Your Voice are short segments where listeners get to add their voice to the discussion. You can either call in to leave a message or record an audio file right on your phone. Either way, tell us about a mental health experience you've had, something that's contributed to your mental health journey, or share a resource that's helped you. Submission details can be found on the State of Mind program page at ksqd.org. Upcoming show topics are obsessive compulsive disorder and mental health support for LGBTQ youth. If you have experience with either of these, we want to hear from you, and your voice may just be on one of our future shows. With regards to today's topic of first responder mental health, we heard from this community member.
Hi, my name is Mike. I'm a somewhat recently retired law enforcement officer with 25 years of service as a first responder. My hope in speaking with you today is that I might be able to reach someone who may be struggling with the symptoms or the effects of post-traumatic stress injuries. Currently, I'm also a volunteer for the First Responder Support Network through the West Coast Post-Trauma Retreat, or WCPR. Now, the retreat itself is a 6-day residential education and treatment program designed to help current or former first responders whose lives have been impacted by the critical incidents and stresses of their work. The goal of WCPR is to help first responders or retirees to regain control over their lives and either return to work or move on into retirement with a new perspective on stress and some more appropriate coping mechanisms and tools to get back to living and enjoying life again. Now, for me, law enforcement wasn't my initial career path. It chose me. But no matter what, I always knew I was going to help people. I was going to protect children and families and prevent bad things from happening to good people. So how'd I get here? Well, I'd also like to share that story with you, but we don't have that kind of time. So I'll share a snapshot of my experience as a first responder and come back with a bit of my journey to recovery following a lifetime of cumulative critical incidents and post-traumatic stress injuries. Like many other first responders, I entered this career believing I could do all things. I was in good shape physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. I was college educated, well-trained, and a true warrior for justice. I was a rescuer, and I was going to save the world and protect the innocent from evil in all forms. I felt nothing could affect me or break me down. I was confident, resilient, and tough, and I loved my job. In opinion, I was really good at it. So for many years, I went to work did my job, and I went home, never really thinking about what I had seen, heard, or done, or how it affected me each day. And like all first responders, over the course of a career, I responded to and dealt with hundreds of people who were likely having the worst days of their lives, and often in absolute crisis. I was sent to countless horrific crime scenes and accidents. All the while I believed I was weathering every storm. And I kept showing up day in and day out. I'd go operational, stuff any thoughts or feelings about anything I'd previously seen or heard or done into the proverbial box. And this seemed to work great for years, so I just kept doing it. Until one day it no longer worked. And I'd slowly begun pushing everyone away. I no longer trusted people, and I began to believe regular people were either ignorant fools or just didn't care enough to pay attention to what was really going on in the world. I tried to share what I knew, but it either scared them or made them withdraw, not wanting to listen or hear my truth. No one seemed to understand me anymore, and I found myself becoming angry and irritable. And I started isolating. I'd somehow lost myself. By the time I realized I needed help and finally asked for it, I'd already pushed my family so far away that I almost lost them completely. So if I could give anyone any advice, it would be to listen to the people closest to you. If there's something going on with you, they probably already know, and they've likely been telling you about it for some time. Listen to them, and please reach out for help. The sooner the better, and the easier it'll be. Take my word for it. Now, I started my journey to recovery 3 years ago as a client at WCPR, and I've returned several times a year since then as a peer because I've seen firsthand the magic that happens up there and the hope that comes from it. And I believe it's now my duty to share what I've gone through on my way back from post-traumatic stress. Thanks for listening, and stay well.
Thank you, Mike. I want to let listeners know that if you or a police officer you know is showing signs of concerning mental health struggles, urge them to call the COP line, 1-800-COPLINE or 1-800-267-5463. This is a resource and outlet that officers from all law enforcement branches can turn to in times of need. Also, there is the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. The phone number is 1-800-273-8255. While this is not first responder specific, they can and will talk to anyone who needs help. First responders and their family members can also contact the First Responder Support Network that offers the West Coast Post-Trauma Retreat and other support services. They can be contacted at info@frsn.org, or you can phone 415-721-9789. This is Deborah Sloss, and I want to say a huge thank you to our guests today, Brian Warren, Connor Bridges, and Laurel Andrus. And thanks to you for joining us here on State of Mind, Being Human, and Living Well. To hear more conversations about mental health and wellness, join us on the first Sunday of every month from 6 to 7 p.m. right here at K-Squid, 90.7 FM. Special thanks to Jeannie Baldzakowski for audio production, to Jennifer Young, who assists with research and outreach, and to Nyla Young for social media support. And thanks to acoustic guitarist Adrian Legg for composing, performing, and donating the use of our theme music. You can find all past episodes of this show on our ksqd.org website by typing State of Mind in the search bar, or subscribe and get them delivered directly to your listening device on either Apple or Google Podcasts. This is listener-supported community radio, KSQD Santa Cruz. Just remember, 90.7 FM, K-Squid, your ink spot on the dial. Stay with us.